The New Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. The Case of the Caribbean Pirate by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Nora Godwin. Narrated by Peter Silverleaf. Just a few days after our trip to Kew Gardens, which was spoiled by a somewhat bizarre murder case, Holmes and I sat at the breakfast table on Baker Street and discussed other things we could do with our free time. "I realize, my dear Watson," Holmes said, "that you are entitled to a replacement appointment since your stay in the Royal Gardens has run a little out of the rudder." "Out of the rudder?" I repeated reproachfully. "No, Holmes, if you want to stick to nautical comparisons, our excursion boat literally shattered on the cliffs of crime." Holmes smiled almost paternally. "Let's agree on stranded," he said. "And now we want to fix up the barge again. After all, it's about your well-being. So, what do you think about walking through the zoo, for example?" I hesitated. "I don't know," I replied slowly. "You would certainly be able to find a corpse even in the guinea pig compound." Before Holmes, who certainly had a curious justification for all this in his mind, could answer, we heard somebody knocking at the door, and our housekeeper, Mrs. Hudson, came in a step. "Excuse me for the disruption, gentlemen," she said, "but a Mr. Blackbeard wishes to speak to you." "Blackbeard?" I asked amusedly. "He might as well be a pirate." Mrs. Hudson coughed. "I think," she replied hesitantly, looking briefly over her shoulder, "I think that might very well be the case." Holmes suddenly raised his head with a glaring look. "A pirate?" he repeated. "He may enter. Just bring him in here, immediately." After Mrs. Hudson had disappeared towards the ground floor, I looked at Holmes puzzled. He simply said, "I've always wanted to meet a real pirate, didn't you?" I shook my head decisively and added, "Holmes, even if it may disappoint you, the fact is, there are no more pirates." The next moment, Mrs. Hudson had returned and stood in the doorway. Next to her was our guest. He was an elderly gentleman whose black beard was already somewhat greyed and whose eye patch was framed by scars at the top and bottom. He took off his old three-pointed hat with a feather, which made his red headscarf visible, bowed, and then came hobbling, as if a wooden leg was stuck in his left boot. Obviously, we were dealing with a pirate. Holmes gave a triumphant look and offered our guest a chair, while Mrs. Hudson, as discreet as always, closed the door from the outside. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," began our pirate, "thank you for welcoming me. I am here because I want to make use of your services." "You're not going to want to hire us for booty quest," I burst out before I thought about it. Holmes looked at me with punishment, but the pirate laughed loudly. "Don't worry, my boy," he assured. "Those times are over. Please forgive this whole appearance. I'm incognito. Of course, my name is not Blackbeard, but Morgan Montgomery." With these words, he removed the eye patch and revealed a second, completely unscathed eye. While Holmes seemed a little disappointed, I finally felt confirmed and asked admittedly in a smug tone, "Does that mean that you are not a pirate after all?" Once again our guest started laughing. "My dear boy," he declared, as he got enough air again, "I am the captain of the Thunderbolt from Port Royal, the fastest sailing ship in the Caribbean. Of course I'm a pirate." I, for my part now, was utterly confused and was not able to tell if we were being messed with, and if so, why one would give us the runaround like that. Holmes, for his part, seemed to be afloat again, and acknowledged the statement only with one word. "Of course." "Well," I began, "so if you're a pirate from Jamaica, Mr. Montgomery—" "Captain," Mr. Montgomery interrupted. I didn't immediately understand and had to ask, "Excuse me, what?" "Captain Montgomery, if I may ask." The pirate taught me in a serious tone. I sighed noticeably. Pardon, Captain Montgomery, I corrected myself. So, if you are the captain of a pirate ship, I would like to ask two questions. On the one hand, has the golden age of piracy not come to an end more than 150 years ago? And on the other hand, to my knowledge, Port Royal sank into the sea in 1692 as a result of an earthquake and a tidal wave, which is why Kingston Harbour was built. You are not a time traveller, or are you? For the third time, I made Montgomery laugh, but then he suddenly became serious and whispered, My young friend, you shouldn't make jokes about time travelling. They are not to be messed with. At least then I knew that we were dealing with a madman, but Montgomery continued. As for your other questions, I will not answer it with another question. Where would you rather set up a pirate hideout? At the Royal Navy's largest commercial port and Caribbean base like Kingston, or in the area of a dilapidated and largely abandoned fishing village like Port Royal? Admittedly, this was a perfectly reasonable justification, which I had not considered. Still, I couldn't just let the alleged charlatan off the hook. All right, Captain Montgomery, I began again. So you want to tell us that you're a pirate? Captain Montgomery immediately jumped up. Don't insult me, he shouted, appearing to reach for his sabre, which fortunately he didn't have with him. I am not a pirate. Outrageous. Holmes felt compelled to intervene. Please stay calm, he said. Dr. Watson certainly had no intention of demeaning you. Would you be so kind as to explain to us what you are and what you are not? The captain hesitated for a moment, then took his seat again, pulled a vessel looking like a field bottle out of his jacket pocket, and took a deep sip. Cuban rum from Havana, he declared, offering us the bottle. Fancy a sip? Very excellent quality. We declined, thankfully, and Montgomery, who calmed down again, began to tell us his whole story. I actually come from the ruins and wooden huts of Port Royal. My parents died early. Ever since I was a young boy, I went to the sea. Therefore, I became an excellent navigator and deck officer, and that's why my crew chose me as captain. Your pirate crew? I asked. Indeed, Captain Montgomery said. That was in the summer of 1861, in the first months of the American Civil War. The Thunderbolt was a caper ship on behalf of the Confederates to lighten the Yankees' merchant ships, of course without injuring the ship's crew. We are honorable men. But you are committing piracy, after all, I remarked with my index finger raised. But Montgomery was not going to be coaxed out of his shell again, and replied calmly, No, we were privateers with a letter of marque given to us by the Confederate government. Also, by the way, with unofficial support from Her Majesty the Queen's government. Indeed, it was a not very glorious episode of British foreign policy to have played an active role on the part of slaveholders in the maritime conflict of the Civil War, allowing and favouring raids from British territory. I do not want to appear unpatriotic, but the Empire was therefore quite rightly condemned to give reparation payments to the United States. For us, it was just business, Montgomery continued, and in no way dishonourable. On the contrary, we were practically in the tradition of Sir Francis Drake, and it was a good deal. The following 3 years we were able to raise a small fortune, especially I as the captain who got twice the share of the booty. But it all came to an end in the fall of 1864. You were right, Dr. Watson. The age of piracy was already over back then. We could no longer compete with steamships, ships' propellers, and armor, but also with modern artillery. Our early tactics became obsolete, and soon the tides turned and we became the hunted. In 1864, the Thunderbolt was brought down by the USS Dictator. That means, I noted, that your pirate career has been over for about 18 years. Indeed, Captain Montgomery said. When our ship was sunk, most of the crew, especially my officers, managed to escape. Unfortunately, the U.S. Navy fished me out of the sea. After the end of the war, I was sentenced to 80 years in prison for piracy, first in Fort Jefferson and then in Alcatraz. But 6 months ago I managed to escape." Montgomery was apparently about to tell us the next fairy tale. "Are you really claiming," I asked incredulously, "that you escaped from the prison island?" The captain did not immediately respond, but took a sip of rum beforehand. "It took me years to dig through the sandstone of the building's walls," he said. "It's not that easy if you only have a tablespoon. I overcame the outer fastening wall made of solid rock with a rope made of handkerchiefs, collected and tied together for years. And then I swam through the bay to the mainland." That must be almost a mile and a half," I cried. "Excuse me, Captain, but at your age it seems to me an almost impossible achievement." Captain Montgomery laughed again in his deep tone. "Maybe if I tell you that halfway, though, I almost drowned and was saved by a dolphin, you are more inclined to believe my story," he said, and continued without waiting for an answer. "Then I made my way by train and a blind passenger across the country from San Francisco to Boston. There I was hired under a false name as a navigator on an English merchant ship, and now I am here." Holmes, who had listened patiently and had gone up and down the room until now, came to the room and took a seat in a chair. "This is an equally exciting and tragic story," he began, "but there is one thing I do not understand, Captain Montgomery. How can we help you?" "Quite simply," the privateer explained. "During my time in prison, I was robbed. I want my property back." Holmes frowned, while I couldn't hold back. "Don't tell me that someone dug up and stole your treasure," I mocked, "which you had laboriously hidden on the secret monkey island in the Bermuda Triangle." Captain Montgomery simply replied without batting an eye, "Yes, that's the way it is." Then he took another sip of rum and clarified, "However, as modern privateers, of course, we did not bury our money, but deposited it in a locker at Barclays Bank, here in London on Lombard Street. But my deposit is empty. During my absence, those who also had access must have cleared it, including my considerable share." To my irritation, Holmes seemed to start finding an interest in this case. "I understand," he said. "And who are these people you are suspecting of stealing your property?" "My former officers," Captain Montgomery replied, "who in the meantime, with my money, built up a bourgeois life here in England. Obviously, they are completely dishonest people who are recklessly violating the pirate code. Death is written upon transgressing." At the last sentence, he jumped up, clenched his fist, and raised then a threatening gesture. "Well, that seems a little rabid to me," Holmes said scathingly. "You are not really planning on enforcing this verdict?" Captain Montgomery seemed to calm down. He sat down again and, as a precaution, took another sip of his rum. "Not at all," he assured. "I just want my money." Then he pulled out a piece of paper from his jacket pocket and handed it to Holmes. "These are the two criminals who robbed me, with their names and addresses. David Jones, my former helmsman, and John Smith, my boatman." Holmes took a look at the note. I looked over my shoulder. "David Jones and John Smith," I repeated. "Seriously? Are the two gentlemen incognito as well?" Captain Montgomery didn't understand. "Why?" he asked. "These are their names, and have always been." Holmes answered before I could. "Well, we have their addresses. Nevertheless, Captain, I still don't know what our role in this matter should be." "I am sure that you will understand," the captain said, "that I can't bring the matter to Scotland Yard. Of course, I could visit Jones and Smith in person, but I think they'll be more willing to cooperate to hand over my assets if a well-known detective like Sherlock Holmes asks them to do so." "So you are asking us to be your errand boys?" I protested, but Holmes told me to hold back. Well, my dear Watson, Holmes said, it may sound unusual, but the whole cause promises an entertaining challenge, with appropriate payment, I suppose. Captain Montgomery nodded. Of course, he said. However, I can only pay you if you succeed, but this is self-explanatory. I did not feel comfortable and had my own doubts about the captain's accountability, but Holmes was on board. We are taking the case, he said, almost solemnly. The captain rose from his chair and reached out to Holmes. Thank you, he said. Thank you for helping an old, penniless sailor to his right. You won't regret it. Then he handed us a second note. I put up at this hotel near the docks. Contact me if you've been successful. Then he moved his eye patch, turned round, hobbling, and went out the door. Of course, we didn't know at that point that this was going to be the last time we saw Captain Montgomery. When we were alone again, Holmes asked, What do you think, Watson? I took a deep breath, because I was given cause for consideration. Well, Holmes, at first I'm not sure whether we are being fooled here. Montgomery's story is quite adventurous, sometimes downright implausible. Holmes nodded approvingly. In fact, some of it may have been somewhat embellished, but that may just be the usual sailor's yarn. In essence, though, there might be some truth to this, and I think we should at least try to verify this accordingly. Anyways, I replied, if Captain Montgomery's claims are halfway true, there is still the question about the legitimacy of his demands. After all, his alleged assets are based on piracy. It seemed like a good point to me, but Holmes managed to surprise me once again. Don't be so finicky, Watson, he replied. Captain Montgomery was a privateer with a quasi-state concession. The financial damage suffered by the shipping companies is likely to be compensated by insurance. The Empire itself has paid reparations to the United States, and the Southern states certainly did not get away unscathed. And Captain Montgomery was imprisoned for nearly 18 years. That should be punishment enough. No? But he was sentenced to 80 years, I said. Well, true, Holmes said, unimpressed. But this shows only two things. First, that the United States justice system sets ridiculous penalties that makes it difficult to take them seriously. Second, despite personal sympathies in the Civil War, it is victor's justice. In the event of a Confederate victory, Captain Montgomery would not have been imprisoned, but given a medal, and it's no use for anyone if Montgomery is now condemned to a lifetime of poverty. Moreover, Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones have undoubtedly broken the rules. I automatically frowned. Against what rules? I wanted to know. Against the pirate code, Holmes claimed, as if this was a matter of course. Don't take this amiss, Holmes, I said, but I doubt that this code is valid on the territory of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Holmes smiled mischievously. True, he replied, but we are dealing with a break-up between fellow pirates, former comrades who were sworn into the code, quite deliberately regardless of the respective state jurisdictions, laws, and jurisprudence. Therefore, we are committed to our client and his legal base. Obviously, it was time to capitulate. Holmes was determined to act. All right, Holmes, I sighed. What are we going to do now? Holmes, who naturally had planned our first steps long before, answered promptly and without thinking. First of all, we will check on the two names that the captain gave us, their origin, their background, their history. We need to be able to assess who we're dealing with before confronting them with Captain Montgomery's story. With the help of our usual discreet sources of information in the police and administration, it was easy to learn more about David Jones and John Smith. We ended up somewhat surprised. Mr. Smith had been an elected member of the British Parliament since 1874, a Tory party man and backbencher with a seat with the dubious constituency of Dunwich. In general, it was assumed that he had bought his mandate. Mr. Jones, for his part, was a successful neurologist and head of department at the Royal Hospital of Bethlehem in Southwark, a psychiatric hospital with dubious history. However, there were no official records of both persons as to what they had done before 1870 or where they were staying. When I presented the research results to Holmes, his determination rose. "Very interesting, my dear Watson," he muttered. "A member of the House of Commons and a colleague of yours." "Do you mind?" I protested. "You have probably never visited any of these institutions. The local mental hospitals are still dark relics of the Middle Ages. I have seen corresponding hospitals in Paris, Zurich, Leipzig, and Vienna, where patients work diligently and progressively. In our case, however, psychiatry is in its infancy. The sick are declared lunatics, locked away, tied up, permanently sedated, or even forced to operate in such a way that their brain becomes pudding. They are guinea pigs at best. I would like to distance myself from this. This is not a glorious chapter of English medicine." Holmes did not expect this vehement rejection. "I understand," he replied. "So you are trying to say that our mental hospitals are more like prisons for the supposedly incurable?" "Quite right," I confirmed. "If Mr. Jones is working in such an asylum for lunatics, I have to doubt his medical seriousness. However, it is regrettable that this kind of occupation is still approved of in our society." Holmes took a few steps up and down. "All of this fits, though," he finally said. "Jones and Smith have left their private lives behind and created a new existence on the basis of their wealth here in England, presumably with the help of false documents and bribery. In doing so, they now have some prestige. They are now among the highest bourgeois circles in London, with corresponding links to the aristocracy, the educational elite, and politics. I have to say, these gentlemen have arranged it in a smart way." "Always assuming," I argued, "that Captain Montgomery told the truth." "There's little doubt about that for me," Holmes said. "And one thing is certain. A visit from the Caribbean past is pretty much the last thing the philanthropic Dr. Jones and the Honourable Member of Parliament, Mr. Smith, may need." "So what are you going to do?" I asked. Holmes smiled with anticipation. "We'll visit them, of course." John Smith's address that we were given was the one from his office in Westminster. It was located on the first floor of a representative building within sight of Westminster Palace, that is, the Houses of the British Parliament. A posh and certainly not cheap location. To our surprise, it was Mr. Smith himself who, on our knock, opened the front door to his premises. His surprise, on the other hand, seemed to be kept within a limit. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" he asked, not necessarily in the kindest tone. "Good morning," I began our introduction. "My name is John Watson, and this is Mr. Sherlock—" "I know who you are," Smith interrupted me immediately. "After all, I regularly read newspapers. I am also sure that you both do not live in my constituency. Therefore, you are probably here for professional reasons. And in this respect, I can assure you that I have nothing to do with it, and I have a hard-hitting alibi." While I didn't know what to think of it, Holmes seemed a little amused by this preemptive explanation. "Wonderful, Mr. Smith," he replied. "It is always good to be able to defend oneself against any accusation. However, we have not in any way accused you of any wrongdoing." "Not yet," Smith corrected curtly. Holmes remained calm and polite. "Actually, all we are concerned with," he said, "is to verify or falsify a presumed fact. We would like to have your esteemed help to do this. Can we enter?" "No," was Smith's quick and blunt response. "I was just about to make my way to Parliament, if you would excuse me." He took the coat and hat from the clothes rack inside next to the door, stepped out and locked the office door from the outside. Inadvertently, all three of us stood in the hallway. "We certainly don't want to stop you," Holmes said. Would you allow us to accompany you a few steps?" Mr. Smith put on the coat and made his way to the gate. "Of course, you are free to go wherever you want to go," he said as he walked down the stairs, "and my privilege is to have only those conversations that are of interest to me." "Of course," Holmes said, following the Member of Parliament, and I followed as well. As we left the house, Smith put his top hat on, stopped briefly, and turned to us. "Lords, I am, as you can imagine, a busy man, so ask your questions if you can't help it, but be brief. What is it all about?" "The matter in question dates back a few years," said Holmes, who then came to the point as requested. "Do you know a Captain Montgomery from earlier times?" Smith showed no emotion, but thought demonstratively for a few seconds. "Montgomery?" he finally said. "Sorry, I have no memory of that name. Who is that?" "According to his own statement," Holmes said, "Captain Montgomery is a former colleague of yours as part of a joint venture in the first half of 1860. Again, Mr. Smith signified that he was scouring his memory, but again remained unsuccessful. "I don't know what it would have been about. I spent the time in question in New England, mainly at Harvard University in Massachusetts. What venture does this Mr. Montgomery like to fantasize about?" "Piracy," I replied very shortly. Mr. Smith began laughing loudly. "Piracy," he repeated. "What excellent humour, Dr. Watson." But Holmes ended Mr. Smith's good mood by saying, "That was not a joke, Mr. Smith. According to Captain Montgomery, you were his boatman on the Thunderbolt, a Confederate adventurer during the Civil War." "And after the end of this venture," I added, "you, according to Captain Montgomery, tricked him out of his share. Now he is politely asking for its return." Mr. Smith had obviously heard enough and made a serious face. "Gentlemen, this is an outrageous accusation, a vicious slander, and I find it scandalous, Mr. Holmes, that you want to risk your reputation in this way. Don't forget, I am a powerful man. A career as a detective can be over quickly." That was when I came to the realization that Mr. Smith definitely had something to hide. Such threats are not spoken without any reason. "The same goes for a career as a politician," Holmes replied, "especially when it's built on lies and crime. Even your immunity as a parliamentarian cannot protect you from this." Mr. Smith put on a dirty grin that would have been truly worthy of a pirate. "Gentlemen," he said, "it seems to me that we don't have much more to say to each other. Fact is, I don't know this Morgan Montgomery, so I didn't steal anything. Of course, he is free to go to court by means of the law, if he so wishes. That's all, gentlemen. Have a nice day." With these words, Mr. Smith quickly walked away. Holmes and I took a carriage to Southwark to see Dr. David Jones at the mental hospital. On the trip, we quickly agreed that the Honourable Member of Parliament, Mr. Smith, certainly did not have a clean vest. Even ignoring his poor manners, I noted his dismissive attitude in the face of potential investigations that could affect him suggest that he clearly does not have a clean slate. Holmes nodded. "There's no doubt about that," he said. Even though he did not know what our interrogations were going to be about, he automatically took a defensive stance. I suppose the theft of Mr. Montgomery's share was certainly not the only property crime Mr. Smith was involved in. But we have to put that aside for the time being. And I'm sure," I added, "that researching at Harvard University would show that he is completely unknown there. In fact, forgery of a law degree is likely to be one of Mr. Smith's minor offences, especially compared to professional piracy." Holmes smiled. "My dear Watson," he asked, "you are not going to finally believe that the story of Captain Montgomery is true?" I just had to think for a moment and then said, "He certainly took his liberty with some of the details, but one can assume that the basic story is probably true. Mr. Smith has also given himself away. He knows Captain Montgomery very well." "Oh?" said Holmes, astonished. "You noticed it?" "Of course I did," I answered confidently, trying to hide my overflowing complacency. Mr. David Jones welcomed us in his clinic's office after we had made an appointment and pretended to need scientific advice in a case. "I'm happy to meet you, Mr. Holmes," Jones said. "Your reputation precedes you. I would be honored if I could actually help you solve a case." Holmes nodded appreciatively. "I'm sure you can," he said. "In fact, we hope to gain more certainty based on your expertise in a complicated matter." "I am at your disposal," Jones said with a smile, while I had to hide my dislike of the form of psychopathology he practiced and advocated. "Well, it's about," Holmes began, "an elderly gentleman whose state of mind is quite obscure to us. To be brief, he considers himself a pirate." Jones professionally folded his forehead. "He considers himself a pirate," he repeated. "This is new. We have an Admiral Nelson, Captain Cook, and 2 times a Christopher Columbus among our occupants, but no freebooter or corsair. Does the man consider himself a certain pirate, maybe a historical figure, like Bartholomew Roberts or Edward Teach?" "I don't think so," Holmes replied. "Or does he think he is a fictional character from literature? The other day, a recently published and apparently highly popular work by a Scottish author named Stevenson, entitled The Treasure Island, fell into my hands. A certain Long John Silver plays a leading role there." "Unfortunately, no," I replied. "The name of our alleged pirate is—" "Is a very ordinary one," Holmes interrupted. "Similar to Smith or, with all due respect, Jones." I immediately understood Holmes' maneuver and remained silent. Jones, however, kept a straight face and only said, "I understand. What else can you tell me about your case?" "Well, Doctor," I began, "our presumed patient dresses like a pirate, speaks like a pirate, and behaves like one. It seems like he's serious." "Of course he does," Dr. Jones said. "A personality disorder of this magnitude is usually seated deeply in the patient's brain. Every reference to reality is lost, in most cases forever. Of course, his delusions often come into conflict with the surrounding reality, which is why rabid behavior often occurs. In these cases, we can usually only do surgery. A simple procedure on the frontal lobe of the brain allows the patient to at least exist quietly." I knew, of course, that it was precisely those operations that would cause more harm than benefit that made these deplorable patients mentally crippled. After that procedure, they would vegetate in a walking coma, unable to make any conscious statements. This was the kind of recovery that our nerve doctors had in mind. "We haven't got that far yet," I replied with certainty. "I suppose," Dr. Jones continued, "that your patient has also made up a watertight story to feed his delusion, right?" "Indeed," Holmes said. "It's a rather adventurous story which has been served up as an experience report. It is about caper rides in the Gulf of Mexico and off the east coast of the United States, until the ship was sunk in the course of a naval battle with a superior armored ship itself. Our pirate was taken prisoner for a few years, and then he managed to escape to England, and now he's here to take revenge on his former comrades." I watched Dr. Jones's reactions closely, but for the time being it didn't lead to anything. "He wants revenge?" he asked. "Absolutely," Holmes confirmed, laughing. "However, the story isn't complete yet. It's getting better. You won't believe it, Dr. Jones, but our pirate claims that during his imprisonment he was cheated out of his treasure by his helmsman and his boatman. And, of course, he wants it back now." Dr. Jones finally asked hesitantly, "Your pirate, he was the captain of the ship?" Yes," Holmes replied. "In his delusion, of course." "And did the ship," Jones stuttered, "of course, in his delusion, also have a name?" Holmes pretended to be thinking. "I'm not sure any more. I think it was something with lightning or thunder—" "Thunderbolt," I threw in. "Oh, yes, thank you, Dr. Watson," said Holmes. Thunderbolt, indeed. That was the name. A bizarre story, isn't it, Dr. Jones? The addressee stood rigidly behind his desk and did not react. Dr. Jones? Asked Holmes. He finally reacted. I just had to think for a moment, he said. I don't want to make a frivolous diagnosis of your case. Holmes nodded. Of course not, he said, seemingly trustfully. Dr. Jones came out from behind his desk and took off his glasses to look particularly serious. If you ask me, gentlemen, he began, then it would be best to place your pirate captain in a closed institution like this one, for his own safety and for the safety of the general public. An identity disorder, especially when the patient is fantasizing about being a violent character of that sort, the character will sooner or later break ground and take action. People could be harmed. I understand, Holmes said. We'll consider that. The final decision on this, Dr. Jones said, addressing me, is, of course, up to the treating doctor. Thank you, Doctor. You have helped us a lot. I sincerely thanked him. We will get back to you. After we had left the building, we sat down across the street in a carriage and waited. I think, my dear Watson, Holmes said, we really scared poor Dr. Jones. He will immediately provide us with the final proof of the veracity of Montgomery's story. For the time being, we watched the clinic door. If we're right, I confirmed, then Dr. Jones and Mr. Smith know each other as former pirate mates. And then Dr. Jones will appear soon and set out with Mr. Smith to discuss what to do next about Captain Montgomery. It took a few more minutes, which Holmes filled with making a pipe, before a carriage drawn by horses actually left the clinic, and we were able to identify Dr. Jones as the only passenger. Holmes knocked through the side window against the coach box and shouted, "Follow that hospital car, but keep quiet." We set ourselves on the move and stayed on Jones's heels with a reasonable distance. His carriage was heading north towards the Thames and crossed London Bridge. In the city, the carriage turned west and reached Westminster as expected, before standing in front of the building with Mr. Smith's office. There Dr. Jones got out and walked up while his carriage waited. We let another 10 minutes pass, and then we would set our plan in motion. I got out of the carriage and Holmes made his way to a previously agreed meeting point, while I continued to watch the building conscientiously. After another 10 minutes, I decided to go upstairs. When I knocked on Mr. Smith's door, it took some time before he opened it. The honourable member stood in front of me, obviously not very pleased to see me again. "You're back," he snorted. "I thought we had already discussed everything." Before he could close the door again, I put a foot in between and shouted, "I'm here without Holmes' knowledge. I want to help you." Mr. Smith hesitated for a moment and then asked me in. The obviously nervous Dr. Jones, whom we met in the meeting room, already had a glass of whisky in his hand to calm down. "No rum?" I asked, when Mr. Smith also offered me a drink. "Unfortunately, no," Mr. Smith replied. "That's not my style, but let's get to the point, Dr. Watson." "Well, gentlemen," I began, "in the present case, the opinions of Mr. Holmes and I differ diametrically. I regret that he believes the story of Mr. Montgomery and is determined to help him. I see things a little differently." Mr. Smith's ears pricked up, while Dr. Jones gave himself another whisky. "As far as I'm concerned," I continued, "I am firmly convinced that Mr. Montgomery is an unpredictable mentally ill person. Already at our first meeting he wanted to attack me with his sabre. Clearly he poses a threat to society, and it is my duty as a doctor to avert any harm to people. In Mr. Montgomery's case, the only way is to keep him safe in a closed clinic." "My thoughts exactly," shouted Jones, raising his glass. "Cheers." "Would you please limit your alcohol consumption a little?" Mr. Smith ordered in a sharp tone. "It seems to me that we still have important things to handle today." "I know the whereabouts of Mr. Montgomery," I said. "We can immediately go to his hotel and take him to the clinic by ambulance. I leave the further treatment to the judgment of my esteemed colleague, Dr. Jones." "Thank you, Dr. Watson," he said, suddenly sober again. "Brain surgery will be essential for poor Mr. Montgomery to finally find peace." Half an hour later, it had already darkened. The carriage of the nerve clinic stopped in front of the hotel, Mermaid's Inn. Mr. Smith, Dr. Jones, and I got out, asked for Mr. Blackbeard's room number at the reception, and made our way to the first floor. The door with the number 7 was not locked. I carefully opened the door and was the first to enter. All I saw was a dark space, in which the silhouettes were only indistinct. On the right wall was a bed in which a person seemed to sleep. "All right," Dr. Jones whispered. "We'll put him in a straitjacket and gag him." But suddenly Mr. Smith pushed himself forward. He shouted, "Forget about it," pulled a revolver and pointed it at the bed. At that moment, an oil lamp lit on the opposite wall, and a human figure with a pistol became visible. It was Holmes. "Good evening, gentlemen," he said. "I was expecting you." While Dr. Jones and Mr. Smith made surprised faces, I took the revolver from the latter without resistance. "You won't need it any more," I said, pointing it at them. "What does that mean?" asked Dr. Jones. "Dr. Watson, we are colleagues." "We are not colleagues," I replied. "You are a disgrace to medicine, if you even have a real medical diploma at all." "And as far as you are concerned, honourable member," Holmes said as he approached, "you are about to make an assassination attempt. However, there are only 2 cushions under this blanket." Mr. Smith still made a confused impression. "But where is Captain Montgomery?" he asked. Holmes raised his shoulders indifferently. "No idea," he replied. "In any other hotel, probably." "You'll never get away with this," exclaimed Mr. Smith. "No court in the world will convict me." Holmes smiled superiorly. "I am of good cheer," he said, "that we will not need a judge. In fact, I am even hopeful that you'll both be cooperating now that Captain Montgomery's story has been proven." "By the way, you betrayed yourself at our first meeting," I said triumphantly. Mr. Smith thought briefly and then asked, "What are you asking for?" "Only Captain Montgomery's share," Holmes replied. "Nothing more. Under the pirate's code. It's a matter of honour, isn't it?" We agreed with Mr. Smith and Dr. Jones that they would deposit the corresponding sum of money in a locker and send us the key on the following day. If necessary, their signed written confessions about their pirate past would be made public. If Captain Montgomery got his share, they would be destroyed. But to our surprise, none of it happened. The next morning, we were just sitting at breakfast. A messenger delivered a letter from Captain Montgomery, including a considerable fee for our activities. The letter showed that while Captain Montgomery had told the truth, he had used us from the beginning, for which he sincerely apologized. The fact was, however, that he had followed us all the time and had only waited until we had lured his former comrades out of the reserve. While we had set a trap for the 2 of them in the hotel, he had broken into their apartments. There he took everything but the kitchen sink and discarded any bank papers that he could not turn into cash into the Thames. Mr. Smith and Dr. Jones were now largely penniless. Captain Montgomery had also taken with him all the original documents of the 2, which would prove their true past. Soon the newspapers all over England would report that the Honourable Member of Parliament John Smith was in fact a hoofsmith from Kentucky, and the respected neurologist Dr. David Jones was a butcher from South Carolina. Of course, as a further consequence, both should lose their posts and face legal proceedings for forgery of documents, violations of commercial law, unjust enrichment, bribery, and, in the case of Dr. Jones, grievous bodily harm. Piracy, however, would not be mentioned, because such a betrayal among former comrades, as Montgomery wrote in his letter, the code emphatically forbade. The letter ended with the words, "Please forgive my hasty departure, but my ship across the Atlantic departed at dawn. I have a lot on my mind. I wanted to have the wooden huts replaced by brick buildings in my run-down home village, buy new boats and nets for fishermen, get medicines, build a school, and also rebuild the church. The wealth generated by piracy and theft will provide a good basis for this. For myself, I reclaim nothing but a roof over my head and the grace of God." When I finished reading Mr. Montgomery's letter, I presented it to Holmes with the words, "This is the best pirate I've ever heard of." Holmes smiled. "Now don't immediately turn him into a modern Robin Hood," he said. "A pirate remains a pirate." Then he folded the letter, put it in an ashtray, and lit it with a match. "What are you doing?" I wanted to know, as the paper slowly burned. "Within the next 4 hours," Holmes said, "the police will knock on our door to inquire of the whereabouts of a pirate from the Caribbean." "And what do we want to say to the officials?" I asked. "The truth," Holmes replied. "There are no more Caribbean pirates."